The research vessel drifted through the darkness of space like a leaf caught in an invisible current. Inside the cramped laboratory, Lyria bent over her microscope, studying samples from a newly discovered planet. She had joined this expedition hoping to find new plant species that could help solve Earth's food shortage problems. Her team of 12 scientists had been traveling for 8 months, and they were finally returning home with promising results. The alarm started as a low hum that grew into a piercing shriek. Lyria looked up from her work as red emergency lights flooded the lab. Captain Holland's voice crackled through the intercom, telling everyone to prepare for possible hostile contact. Lyria felt her heart racing as she secured her samples and headed toward the emergency stations. She had heard stories about alien encounters, but Earth's small fleet had always avoided conflict with the more advanced species. Through the viewport, she saw them approaching. 3 massive ships that looked like they were carved from silver crystal moved toward them with graceful precision. The Elven fleet was legendary throughout known space. They were the oldest civilization in the galaxy, and they treated younger species with cold indifference. Lyria watched as blue beams of light shot from the Elven ships and wrapped around their vessel like chains. The research ship's engines died instantly, and they were being pulled toward the largest Elven cruiser. Captain Holland tried to negotiate over the communication channels. He explained they were peaceful researchers heading back to Earth with botanical samples. The Elven commander who appeared on their screens had features that were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. His face was angular and perfect like a statue, and his eyes held no warmth at all. He spoke in Galactic Common with an accent that made every word sound like a judgment. He told them their ship had entered restricted space and they would be detained for processing. The elves forced their way onto the research vessel within minutes. Lyria and her crew were gathered in the main corridor, as Elven soldiers in gleaming armor surrounded them. The soldiers moved with liquid grace and carried weapons that hummed with energy. One of the elves scanned each human with a small device and seemed particularly interested in Lyria's readings. He spoke to his commander in their own language, and Lyria caught a few words she had learned from xenolinguistics courses. They were talking about her neural patterns and something about bonding capabilities. They were transported to the Elven flagship and separated into different holding cells. Lyria found herself alone in a room that was too clean and too bright. The walls seemed to glow with their own light and there was no visible door. She tried to stay calm and remember her training, but fear crept through her chest like ice water. Hours passed, or maybe days, since there was no way to tell time in that place. Eventually, a section of the wall slid open and 2 elves entered wearing long robes, marked with strange symbols. They introduced themselves as research specialists and explained that humans had a unique ability to bond emotionally with other species. The elves found this fascinating because their own species had lost that capability thousands of years ago. They could control animals through magic and technology, but they could never truly connect with them. Lyria demanded to know about her crew and asked when they would be released. The elves ignored her questions and instead began their tests. The experiment started gently enough with simple questions and neural scans, but as weeks turned into months, the tests became more invasive and painful. They would inject her with different compounds and force her to interact with various creatures while monitoring her brain activity. Lyria learned that most of her crew had already died from similar experiments. Only 3 others remained alive, and they were in different facilities. She felt rage building inside her like a storm, but she forced herself to stay alert and observe everything. The elves were arrogant in their superiority, and they talked freely around her, assuming she could not understand their language. But Lyria had always been good with languages, and she spent every moment learning their words and phrases. She discovered that the facility where they held her was built around a vault containing 2 dragon eggs. The elves had stolen these eggs centuries ago from a forbidden world, but they could never hatch them. Dragons were immune to elven magic and refused to serve any species that tried to control them. One of the younger researchers, named Therion, seemed less cruel than the others. He would sometimes speak to Lyria as if she were a person instead of a specimen. Through him, she learned that the elves were desperate to bond with dragons because they feared an upcoming war with another powerful species. Dragons could survive in deep space without ships, and their fire could burn through any shield technology. The species that controlled dragons would control the galaxy. Lyria began planning her escape, but she knew she needed more than just freedom. She needed a way to fight back against the elves, and she needed to find what remained of her crew. During one of the experiments, they exposed her to dragon genetic material, trying to see if human bonding capabilities extended to creatures they had never met. Lyria felt something stir in her consciousness when she touched the dragon tissue sample. It was like a door opening in her mind to a vast and ancient intelligence. She started pretending the experiments were affecting her mind, making her seem confused and compliant. The elves reduced their security around her, believing she was broken. Therion took pity on her, and would sometimes leave her restraint slightly loose during recovery periods. Lyria used these moments to explore the facility through ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels. The complex was enormous, but she slowly mapped it out in her memory. 3 months into her captivity, she found the vault containing the dragon eggs. The room was deep underground, protected by multiple security systems and magical barriers. The eggs sat on pedestals surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked their vital signs. They were larger than Lyria expected, each one the size of a small vehicle. The shells were deep black with veins of silver running through them like lightning frozen in stone. She could feel warmth radiating from them even from across the room. Lyria knew this was her chance, but she had to wait for the right moment. She continued her active compliance and gathered information about guard rotations and security protocols. She learned that once every 10 days there was a shift change that lasted exactly 7 minutes, when the vault was monitored by only automated systems. The elves were so confident in their magic and technology that they never considered a prisoner might reach this place. On the night of the next shift change, Lyria made her move. She had stolen a security badge from Therion during her last examination and used it to bypass the first 3 doors. The magical barriers were harder, but she had watched the elves deactivate them dozens of times through security footage. Her hands shook as she traced the correct patterns in the air, hoping she had memorized the sequence correctly. The barriers flickered and dissolved. She stood before the dragon eggs, feeling their warmth wash over her like summer sun. Lyria did not know what to do or what to say. She only knew that these creatures had been prisoners just like her. She reached out and placed her hands on the nearest egg. The shell was rough under her palms, and she could feel a heartbeat deep inside. She began to sing softly an old lullaby her grandmother had taught her back on Earth. It was a song about stars and freedom, and finding your way home. The egg trembled under her hands. The egg cracked with a sound like thunder contained in a whisper. Lines of golden light spread across the black shell as something inside pushed against its prison. Lyria stepped back but kept singing, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The second egg began to vibrate in response, and soon both eggs were breaking apart in synchronized rhythm. Pieces of shell fell away, revealing the creatures within. The dragons emerged wet and steaming. They were small at first, no larger than cats, but they grew as Lyria watched. Their scales shifted from soft membrane to hardened armor in seconds. One dragon was pure midnight black, while the other had scales that shimmered between black and deep purple. Their eyes opened and fixed on Lyria with intelligence that made her breath catch. These were not animals or simple beasts. These were ancient beings wearing flesh for the first time in centuries. The black dragon spoke directly into Lyria's mind without words. Images and emotions flooded through her consciousness. She saw the world where dragons were born, a place of volcanic mountains and crystal caves. She felt the rage of dragons when the elves came with their magic nets and stole eggs from nesting mothers. She understood that dragons had been waiting for someone who could touch them without trying to control them. They had been waiting for her. The facility alarms exploded into sound. Red lights flashed and automated turrets dropped from the ceiling. The elves had detected the hatching and security teams were already rushing toward the vault. Lyria felt panic rising, but the purple dragon nudged her leg with its head. Warmth spread from the contact, and suddenly she could feel what the dragons felt. They were not afraid. They were finally free, and they were angry. The vault door burst open, and a dozen elven soldiers poured in with weapons raised. The black dragon moved faster than thought. Fire erupted from its mouth in a stream of white heat that melted the soldiers' weapons and sent them diving for cover. The purple dragon spread wings that seemed too large for the room and created a barrier of flame between Lyria and the elves. She felt their presence in her mind, guiding her toward a ventilation shaft that led upward. They moved through the facility like a storm. The dragons grew larger with each passing minute, as if the act of breathing and moving fed their growth. By the time they reached the main research level, both dragons were the size of horses. Elven researchers scattered as fire filled the corridors. Lyria searched desperately for any sign of her surviving crew members. The black dragon seemed to sense her need and led her toward the medical wing. She found them in containment cells that were more like coffins than rooms. 3 humans remained alive from her original crew. Marcus was a geologist who had lost his legs in the experiments. Claire had been a botanist, but now her eyes were vacant from neural damage. And then there was old Professor Kim, who had been their team leader. He looked up as Lyria burst into the cell block and tears ran down his weathered face. He had thought everyone else was dead. The dragons melted through the cell doors with careful precision. Lyria helped Marcus onto the purple dragon's back while the black dragon lowered itself for Claire and Professor Kim. The old man was weak, but his mind was still sharp. He told Lyria that they had killed over 40 elves during their experiments. He said it was time to make them pay for every life taken. Lyria felt that rage mirror her own, and she nodded. They fought their way to the hangar bay. The facility was built into an asteroid, and the hangar was the only way out into space. Elven soldiers tried to stop them with energy weapons and magic barriers, but dragonfire burned through everything. The black dragon had grown large enough to carry all 4 humans on its back, while the purple dragon flew alongside them, breathing flames that kept the elves at bay. In the hangar, dozens of elven ships were docked for maintenance. Lyria spotted a small scout vessel that looked fast and maneuverable. She directed the dragons toward it, while Professor Kim used his old security clearance to override the launch protocols. The elves had not revoked his access codes, assuming he was too broken to use them. It was a fatal mistake. They loaded into the scout ship and Lyria took the pilot seat. She had basic flight training, but nothing prepared her for flying an elven vessel. The controls were intuitive, responding to thought as much as touch. The dragons coiled in the cargo bay, their presence in her mind, helping her understand the ship's systems. When she thought about moving forward, the ship responded. When she needed shields, they activated automatically. The facility's defensive systems came online as they launched. Plasma cannons tracked their vessel and launched volleys of deadly fire. The dragons extended their consciousness through the ship's systems, confusing the targeting computers. Lyria pushed the engines to maximum, and the scout ship shot out of the hangar like a bullet. Behind them, explosions blossomed as stray shots hit fuel tanks and ammunition stores. They escaped into open space, but Lyria knew pursuit would come quickly. The Elven Empire did not tolerate losses, and they would send warships to hunt down their escaped prisoners. She plotted a course toward the nearest neutral trading station, where they might find allies or at least a place to hide. The dragons had other ideas. Images flooded her mind, showing her a different path. They wanted to go to the dark spaces between stars where elven sensors could not track them. Professor Kim came forward to the cockpit, leaning heavily on Claire, who was slowly regaining her awareness. He looked at Lyria with respect and told her she had become something new. She was the first human to bond with dragons, and that made her the most dangerous person in the galaxy to the Elven Empire. They would never stop hunting her. She would need to become a hunter herself if she wanted to survive. Marcus worked on the ship's systems from his position in the navigation chair. Despite losing his legs, his hands were still skilled with technology. He managed to hack into the scout ship's database and download everything it contained: Elven star charts, military codes, research files, and most importantly, the locations of other secret facilities where they conducted their experiments. The data was worth more than any treasure in the galaxy. They spent 3 days in the darkness between stars while Lyria learned to truly communicate with the dragons. The black dragon's name translated roughly as Shadow Flame, while the purple one called itself Voidfire. They were siblings from the same clutch, and they had been sleeping in their eggs for over 200 years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. They chose Lyria because she sang to them without expectation or demand. She treated them as equals, not as tools or weapons. The dragons taught Lyria how to fly with them in the vacuum of space. They could generate fields around themselves that allowed them to move faster than any ship. When Lyria was near them, she could share in this ability. Together they practiced maneuvers that seemed impossible. The dragons could turn on invisible axes and accelerate to speeds that should have killed organic beings. But dragonfire protected what they valued. Professor Kim spent his time analyzing the stolen data. He found records of 17 other facilities conducting similar experiments on different species. The elves were trying to unlock the secret of bonding because their own society was dying. Thousands of years of genetic manipulation and magical enhancement had stripped away their ability to feel genuine connection. They ruled the galaxy, but they were hollow inside. They hoped that by understanding bonding, they could restore what they had lost. Claire's mind began to heal in the presence of the dragons. Whatever the elves had done to her neural pathways was slowly reversing. She told Lyria that she remembered everything from the experiments. She remembered the other humans who had died screaming. She remembered the elven researchers taking notes while people begged for mercy. She remembered, and she would never forget. When she looked at Lyria now, there was something hard and sharp in her eyes. She wanted revenge just like all of them. Marcus finished building a communication system that could broadcast across multiple frequencies without revealing their location. Professor Kim wanted to tell the galaxy what the elves were doing. He wanted to expose their secret experiments and turn public opinion against them. But Lyria had a different idea. She wanted to hit them where it hurt. She wanted to free every prisoner they held and destroy every facility they operated. She wanted to make the elves afraid. Their first target was a mining facility in the Vega system. According to the stolen data, the elves were using slave labor from 3 different species to extract rare minerals from asteroid fields. The facility had minimal military presence because the elves never expected anyone to challenge them so deep in their territory. Lyria studied the facility's layout for hours, memorizing every corridor and security checkpoint. The dragons rested in the cargo bay, but she could feel them in her mind, patient and ready. They approached the facility during a shift change when traffic was heaviest. The scout ship's identification codes were still valid, and the automated systems let them dock without question. Lyria wore an elven uniform taken from the ship's storage while her crew stayed hidden in the cargo bay. She walked through the facility with confident strides, pretending to be an inspector, conducting a surprise audit. The real elven workers barely looked at her, too focused on their own tasks. She found the slave quarters in the lowest levels of the facility. Hundreds of beings from different worlds were crammed into spaces meant for cargo. They wore collars that shocked them if they moved too slowly or spoke without permission. Lyria felt rage burning in her chest, but she kept her expression cold and neutral like an elf. She accessed a maintenance terminal and downloaded the collar deactivation codes while pretending to check inventory records. The dragons launched their attack exactly on schedule. Shadowflame and Voidfire emerged from the docked scout ship and tore through the facility's outer hull. Alarms screamed as atmosphere vented into space. Elven soldiers rushed to defensive positions, but they were trained to fight other ships, not creatures that could fly through vacuum and breathe fire hot enough to melt battle armor. The dragons moved like shadows and lightning striking from impossible angles. Lyria activated the deactivation codes and every collar in the slave quarters fell open. The prisoners looked at her with confusion and hope mixed together. She told them in Galactic Common that they were free and that ships were waiting in the hangar. Many did not believe her at first. Freedom was not something that happened to slaves in Elven territory, but then the facility shook as dragonfire ripped through another section, and they understood this was real. She led them through the chaos toward the hangar. Some were too weak to run, so others carried them. They moved as a group, protecting each other like they had learned to do during their captivity. Elven soldiers tried to stop them, but Lyria had stolen a plasma rifle from a security locker. She was not a soldier, but at close range she did not need to be. Anyone who pointed a weapon at the fleeing prisoners went down. In the hangar, the dragons had herded all the elven personnel into a corner and kept them pinned with walls of flame. Voidfire had grown large enough to carry dozens of people on its back, while Shadowflame guarded the exits. Lyria directed the former slaves into 3 cargo ships that were fueled and ready. Professor Kim took control of one ship while Marcus piloted another despite his missing legs. Claire stayed with Lyria on the scout vessel. They escaped before elven reinforcements could arrive. The dragons flew alongside the convoy, protecting them from automated defenses. Lyria set a course for a free world on the edge of known space where the former slaves could start new lives. During the journey, she learned their stories. They came from peaceful worlds that had refused to join the Elven Empire. The elves had invaded and taken them as punishment for their defiance. Some had been slaves for decades. News of the attack spread through underground networks faster than Lyria expected. Other oppressed species began to whisper about the human who rode dragons and burned elven facilities. Some called her a myth or propaganda. Others called her a terrorist. But those who had suffered under elven rule called her hope. Within weeks, Lyria received encrypted messages from resistance groups asking for her help. The second attack came on a research station orbiting a gas giant. This facility specialized in genetic experiments, trying to create weapons from captured creatures. Lyria could feel the dragon's rage as they approached. Dragons considered all living things sacred, and what the elves did here was worse than murder. It was desecration. She did not try to calm Shadowflame and Voidfire. She let them burn. The station's defenses were stronger than the mining facility. Automated turrets and shield generators protected every approach vector. But the dragons had been teaching Lyria new abilities. When she was close to them, she could see through their eyes and sense through their consciousness. Together, they found weaknesses in the shield grid that no computer would detect. Small fluctuations in the energy field that lasted only microseconds. The dragons could slip through these gaps like smoke through a keyhole. They materialized inside the station's main research wing. Scientists scattered as dragonfire consumed their equipment, and test subjects were freed from containment. Some of the creatures were too damaged to survive. Others had been changed so much they could not remember what they once were. Lyria felt tears on her face as she ended the suffering of those who could not be saved. It was a mercy the elves had never offered. She found the station's main database and copied everything before destroying the servers. The files contained evidence of crimes that would shock even species allied with the elves. Experiments on sentient beings testing pain thresholds and fear responses. Attempts to weaponize diseases and create biological weapons. Programs to breed slave species that could not resist commands. The elves had been doing this for centuries, hidden behind their reputation for superiority. Professor Kim used the stolen data to create detailed reports that he sent to every major news network in the galaxy. The elven government tried to suppress the information, but it spread too quickly. Independent journalists started asking questions. Trade partners demanded investigations. Species that had trusted the elves began pulling back their support. The perfect facade of elven civilization was cracking. The third attack hit a military research facility on a moon covered in ice. This was where the elves developed their most advanced weapons and trained their elite soldiers. It was also where they kept prisoners considered too dangerous to hold anywhere else. According to the data, several human military officers were imprisoned there, along with leaders of other resistance movements. Lyria knew this would be the most dangerous mission yet, but she could not leave them behind. They spent weeks planning the assault. Marcus modified the scout ship with stolen technology, improving its weapons and shields. Claire had fully recovered, and her experience as a scientist helped them understand the facility's security systems. Professor Kim coordinated with resistance groups who provided intelligence and distraction attacks to split elven forces. The dragons practiced new combat techniques, pushing their abilities beyond what Lyria thought possible. The attack came during a winter storm when visibility was nearly zero and sensors were scrambled by electromagnetic interference. Lyria piloted the scout ship through howling winds while the dragons flew beside them, invisible against the ice clouds. They struck the facility's power core first, plunging everything into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, but they provided barely enough illumination to see. Elven soldiers responded with brutal efficiency. These were not researchers or administrators. These were warriors who had trained for centuries, and they did not panic. They formed defensive positions and used terrain to their advantage. Energy weapons lit up the darkness, and magic barriers appeared to block the corridors. But they had never fought dragons before, and they had never faced someone like Lyria. She moved through the facility with the dragons in her mind, guiding her steps. She could feel where enemies waited in ambush and sense traps before triggering them. Shadowflame and Voidfire took different routes, creating chaos and confusion. The elven defenders could not coordinate when Dragonfire kept destroying their communication systems. They fought well, but they fought alone. Lyria found the high-security cells in the deepest level of the facility. The prisoners were kept in stasis fields that suspended them between moments. She recognized Commander Davis from Earth's defense fleet. He had been missing for 5 years, declared dead after his ship disappeared near Elven space. Now she understood he had been captured and held here all this time. She found 12 other humans and twice as many prisoners from other species. The stasis fields required careful deactivation, or they would kill the prisoners instantly. Marcus talked Lyria through the process over the communication link while fighting off elven soldiers, trying to retake the power core. Each field took precious minutes to safely shut down, and she could hear fighting getting closer. Claire held the corridor entrance with a plasma cannon, laying down covering fire. Professor Kim hacked the facility's systems, locking doors and redirecting security forces away from their position. The last prisoner woke just as elven reinforcements breached the outer defenses. Commander Davis recovered quickly despite 5 years of suspended animation. He took one look at the situation and started organizing an evacuation. The freed prisoners were weak, but they were trained fighters and they knew how to work together. They formed a defensive line while Lyria led the injured toward the extraction point. The battle for the ice facility turned into a running fight through frozen corridors. Commander Davis proved why he had led Earth's defense fleet as he coordinated the prisoners into effective fighting units. They used captured elven weapons and their knowledge of military tactics to hold off forces that outnumbered them 10-1. But Lyria knew they could not win through conventional combat. They needed the dragons, and they needed to leave before orbital bombardment turned the entire moon into molten slag. Shadowflame crashed through the facility's outer wall, creating an exit where none existed before. Ice and metal exploded inward as the massive dragon forced its way into the complex. Void fire entered from above, tearing through roof sections like they were paper. The elves had never designed their fortifications to defend against creatures that could ignore walls and doors. Their perfect security systems meant nothing against dragon fire that melted through any material. They evacuated through the holes the dragons created. Lyria and Claire carried wounded prisoners while Commander Davis and his recovered officers provided covering fire. The storm outside had intensified into a full blizzard, but the dragons generated heat that kept everyone warm. Void fire curled its body around the group, forming a living shield, while Shadowflame held off elven soldiers trying to pursue. The scout ship descended through. The storm piloted remotely by Marcus and the freed. Prisoners loaded aboard in organized groups. The elven commander of the facility refused to let them escape without a final confrontation. She was an ancient warrior named Silmara, who had fought in wars before humans had discovered fire. She emerged from the facility surrounded by her personal guard, all of them wearing enchanted armor that shimmered with protective spells. Her voice carried across the howling wind as she challenged Lyria to single combat. If Lyria won, they could leave. If she lost, the prisoners would return to their cells. Lyria knew it was a trap, but she also knew Silmara's pride would not allow treachery in formal combat. The Elven Warrior Code was one of the few things they still honored from their ancient past. Commander Davis argued against it, saying they should just fight their way out. But Lyria understood that this was about more than escape. This was about showing the galaxy that elves could lose, that their supposed superiority was a lie. She accepted the challenge. They faced each other in a circle cleared by dragonfire. Silmara moved with grace that came from thousands of years of practice. Her blade was forged from starlight and magic, and it could cut through almost anything. Lyria held a simple plasma blade taken from an elven soldier. She had basic combat training, but nothing compared to her opponent's experience. The smart choice would have been to refuse this fight. Lyria had stopped making smart choices when the elves had killed her crew. Silmara attacked with speed that seemed impossible. Her blade traced patterns in the air that left glowing trails. Each strike came from a different angle, and each one would have been fatal. Lyria dodged and blocked, relying on instinct more than skill. She could feel the dragons in her mind, lending her their reflexes and awareness. She moved like they did, finding gaps in her opponent's perfect technique. Silmara's confidence faltered as her strikes continued to miss. The fight lasted minutes but felt like hours. Lyria took several cuts that would have killed a normal human, but dragon bonding had changed her in ways she was still discovering. Her wounds closed as fast as they opened. Blood froze in the ice wind before it could fall. Silmara realized too late that she was not fighting just a human. She was fighting someone who carried dragon fire in her veins. The ancient warrior pressed her attack with desperate fury, but Lyria had stopped retreating. She counterattacked with moves no human should know. The dragons were teaching her through the bond, showing her techniques from species that had fought dragons and lost. She moved like water, flowing around Silmara's strikes and responding with perfect economy. Her plasma blade found gaps in the enchanted armor. The elven warrior stumbled, and Lyria drove her blade through the ancient fighter's chest. Silmara looked surprised as she fell to her knees. She had never imagined dying to a human. The elven soldiers watched their commander fall, and something broke inside them. Silmara had been a legend, someone they thought could never be defeated. Her death proved that everything they believed about elven superiority was wrong. Some threw down their weapons and fled. Others charged forward with rage and grief overwhelming their discipline. Commander Davis and his officers cut them down without mercy. There would be no more prisoners taken. Not after what they had endured. They escaped into orbit just as elven warships arrived. The scout ship was fast, but it could not outrun military vessels designed for pursuit. The dragons spread their wings in the void of space and created a distortion field that bent light and sensor readings. The elven warships fired blindly, filling space with plasma and missiles. But every shot missed as the dragons carried the scout ship through impossible trajectories. They jumped to hyperspace before the elves could regroup, and by the time the enemy realized what happened, they were 3 systems away. The freed prisoners needed medical attention and rehabilitation. Commander Davis knew of a secret human outpost in neutral territory where refugees gathered beyond elven reach. Lyria set course for this sanctuary, while Professor Kim transmitted their combat footage to every news network in the galaxy. The recording of Lyria defeating Silmara spread like wildfire. Billions watched as a human warrior brought down an elven legend. The propaganda value was immeasurable. The outpost was hidden inside a massive asteroid field where sensors were unreliable. Thousands of humans lived there along with members of other species who had escaped elven territory. They had built a community from salvaged technology and desperation. When Lyria's ship arrived, the entire population gathered to see the woman who rode dragons. Children pointed at Shadowflame and Voidfire with wonder, while their parents whispered prayers of gratitude. Commander Davis took charge of integrating the freed prisoners into the outpost's defense force. He told Lyria that more humans were out there still held in elven facilities, and they needed to be rescued. But he also warned that the elves would respond to these attacks with overwhelming force. They had lost face, and they would do anything to restore their image of invincibility. War was coming, whether anyone wanted it or not. Lyria spent days in meditation with the dragons, learning the full extent of their bond. She discovered she could share more than just senses and reflexes. She could access their memories, stretching back millions of years. She saw the rise and fall of countless civilizations. She saw the elves when they were young and humble before pride corrupted them. She saw what they had become and what they feared most. They feared becoming obsolete. They feared species like humans who could grow and adapt while elves remained frozen in their perfection. The dragons showed her something else as well. They showed her other dragon eggs hidden throughout the galaxy, waiting for the right moment to hatch. The elves had stolen dozens of eggs over the centuries and stored them in secret vaults. If those eggs could be freed, and if they bonded with other species, the balance of power would shift forever. The elven empire would fall and something new would rise. Lyria understood this was bigger than revenge or rescue. This was about changing the galaxy. Professor Kim had been analyzing all the data they collected from elven facilities. He discovered patterns in their research that pointed to a central location, a hidden facility where the elves conducted their most secret experiments. This place was where they tried to restore their lost ability to bond with other beings. It was also where they kept their most dangerous prisoners, including human telepaths and empaths, who could potentially break their mental conditioning. If this facility could be found and destroyed, it would cripple the elven research programs. Claire volunteered to lead the reconnaissance mission. Her experience as a botanist meant she understood ecosystems and patterns. She could spot things others missed. Marcus would provide technical support hacking into elven databases to find clues. Commander Davis offered his best soldiers, but Lyria refused. This mission was too dangerous to risk more lives. She would go alone with the dragons. If they failed, at least the outpost would survive. The search took months of careful investigation. They followed money trails and supply shipments through a maze of shell companies and false records. Lyria hit small elven outposts, stealing data and interrogating researchers. Some gave up information willingly once they saw what Dragonfire could do. Others remained loyal until the end. She learned that the secret facility was called the Genesis Complex, and it was hidden in a nebula where scanners did not work. Only a handful of elves knew its exact location, and they were all high-ranking members of the ruling council. Lyria decided to make the Elven Council come to her. She broadcast a challenge across every communication channel in the galaxy. She called out the council members by name and accused them of crimes against countless species. She showed evidence of their experiments and the suffering they caused. She promised that if they did not face justice willingly, she would hunt them down one by one. The message ended with images of Shadowflame and Voidfire flying through space, beautiful and terrible. The challenge sent shockwaves through the galactic community. For the first time in recorded history, someone had directly confronted the Elven ruling council and lived to tell about it. Allied species scrambled to distance themselves from the accusations, while others who had suffered in silence began speaking up. The careful diplomatic balance that had kept the elves in power for millennia started to crack. Some council members wanted to ignore the challenge, but they could not ignore public opinion turning against them. The elves responded by declaring, Lyria, an enemy of civilization, and placing a bounty on her head large enough to buy star systems. Mercenaries and bounty hunters from a dozen species began searching for her. But they found nothing. Lyria had learned to move like the dragons through spaces between spaces where normal tracking did not work. She struck at elven interests seemingly at random, keeping them off balance and afraid. A supply depot destroyed here. A patrol ship ambushed there. Each attack was surgical and precise. What the elves did not know was that Lyria was following a pattern. Each target she hit was connected to the Genesis complex in some way. Supply shipments that went to nowhere on official records. Personnel transfers that disappeared into administrative gaps. She was mapping the invisible network that supported the secret facility. Professor Kim analyzed every piece of data she gathered, and slowly the picture became clear. The Genesis complex was located in the Serpent Nebula inside a pocket of stable space, hidden by natural interference. Commander Davis warned her that assaulting the complex would be suicide. The facility would have defenses beyond anything she had encountered before. Elite guards and automated weapons powerful enough to threaten small fleets. Even with the dragons, the odds were impossible. Lyria listened to his concerns and thanked him for his honesty. Then she told him she was going anyway. Some things mattered more than survival. Some fights needed to be fought even if you could not win. She spent her last days at the outpost preparing for the mission. The dragons had grown enormous now, each one the size of a battleship. They could carry her through hyperspace wrapped in fields of fire that bent reality around them. Claire gave her upgraded armor made from salvaged elven technology. Marcus programmed a virus into her equipment that would corrupt any system it touched. Professor Kim just hugged her and told her she had already done more than anyone could ask. The journey to the Serpent Nebula took 2 weeks of hard travel. Lyria used the time to deepen her connection with Shadowflame and Voidfire. She learned to see through their eyes completely and experience the universe as they did. Space was not empty to dragons. It was full of currents and flows of energy invisible to normal senses. They rode these currents like birds rode wind. They showed her how to navigate without instruments by feeling the pull of gravity wells and the push of solar winds. The nebula was beautiful and deadly. Clouds of gas glowed in shades of purple and green lit by dying stars. Radiation levels were high enough to kill unshielded organic life in minutes. But the dragons protected her, wrapping her in fields that filtered out the harmful energy, while letting her breathe and move freely. They flew through the clouds following paths that existed only in dragon memory. Paths that led to the heart of the nebula, where stable space waited. The Genesis complex appeared suddenly as they cleared a particularly dense cloud bank. It was built into a massive asteroid that had been hollowed out and reinforced with technology and magic. Sensor arrays covered its surface, watching for intruders. Weapon platforms orbited the facility, ready to destroy anything that approached without proper identification codes. Defensive shields shimmered around the entire structure, strong enough to withstand sustained bombardment from a fleet. Lyria did not try to be subtle. She flew straight toward the facility with the dragons at her side. The weapon platforms opened fire, immediately filling space with plasma and missiles. Shadowflame and Voidfire moved through the barrage like dancers, anticipating every beat. They breathed fire that consumed incoming missiles and melted weapon platforms. The defensive shields sparked and failed as Dragonflame proved hot enough to overwhelm their energy capacity. The elves had built their defenses to stop fleets and armies. They had not built them to stop dragons. She crashed through the outer hull and into the facility's main corridor. Alarms screamed and bulkheads slammed shut, trying to contain the breach. But the dragons tore through barriers like they were made of cloth. Elven soldiers in heavy combat armor tried to stop them, but their weapons barely scratched dragon scales. Lyria rode on Shadowflame's back, directing their path through her mental connection. She could feel where the most important areas were, by the density of security and the strength of magical wards. They found the central research wing behind layers of protection that would have stopped any conventional assault. Inside the wing, dozens of prisoners floated in stasis fields similar to what Lyria had seen before. But these prisoners were different. They glowed with internal light that pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats. The elven researchers had been trying to force bonding capabilities into their own genetics by studying those who naturally possessed such abilities. The prisoners were being slowly consumed by the experiments their life force drained to fuel elven transformation. Among the prisoners, Lyria found 5 humans. All of them were telepaths or empaths, individuals born with abilities that made them special. even among their own kind. The elves had been harvesting their neural patterns, trying to copy the human capacity for genuine emotional connection. She recognized one of the prisoners as her sister Kate, who had disappeared 10 years ago during a deep space exploration mission. Lyria had thought her sister was dead. Now she understood Kate had been here suffering for a decade. The rage that filled Lyria in that moment was beyond words. It was pure and absolute. The dragons felt it through their bond, and they responded. Fire erupted from them, hot enough to turn stone to vapor. The research wing burned. Equipment that represented centuries of work melted into slag. Elven researchers tried to flee, but the dragons were faster. Not all of them died. Some were allowed to run so they could tell others what happened when you took someone that dragons valued. Lyria shut down the stasis fields, carefully bringing each prisoner back to consciousness. Kate woke last, and her eyes took a moment to focus. When she recognized her sister, she started crying tears that had been held back for 10 years. They did not have time for reunion. The facility's self-destruct system had been activated. The elves would rather destroy everything than let their secrets be captured. They had minutes before the entire complex exploded. Shadow Flame and Void Fire expanded their protective fields to cover all the freed prisoners. Some were too weak to walk, so the dragons carried them gently in their claws. They fought their way back to the breach in the outer hull while explosions rocked the facility. Entire sections were venting atmosphere and collapsing. Elven personnel were evacuating in escape pods, not caring about prisoners or research anymore. Just desperate to survive. They cleared the facility moments before it detonated. The explosion lit up the entire nebula, turning night into day. Debris spread outward in an expanding sphere of destruction. The Genesis complex, which had existed in secret for over 1,000 years, was gone. With it went the elven dream of restoring what they had lost. They would never regain the ability to truly bond with other beings. That capacity required empathy and humility. The elves had neither. The return journey to the outpost was slower because of the rescued prisoners. Kate stayed close to Lyria, hardly believing her sister was real. She told stories of her captivity of the other prisoners who had died before rescue could come. She spoke of the elven researchers who saw them as nothing more than experimental subjects. Her words confirmed what Lyria already knew. There could be no peace with the Elven Empire, only surrender or annihilation. When they reached the outpost, thousands gathered to welcome them back. The freed telepaths and empaths were greeted as heroes. Medical teams rushed to help those who needed treatment. Commander Davis pulled Lyria aside and told her that her broadcast from the Genesis complex had been received across the galaxy. Every species had seen what the elves were doing. The denials and cover-ups would no longer work. Political alliances were shifting. War was inevitable now. The Elven Council sent a final message to Lyria offering a truce. They proposed that she surrender herself for trial, and in exchange they would grant amnesty to all humans in their territory. Professor Kim analyzed the offer and declared it a trap. The elves had no intention of honoring any agreement. They wanted Lyria because she represented their greatest failure. A human had bonded with dragons and destroyed their most secret facility. Her existence proved that humans were not inferior. That was a truth the elves could not accept. Lyria rejected their offer publicly. Instead, she issued her own demands. The elves would release all prisoners in their territory. They would open their facilities to independent inspection. They would pay reparations to species they had harmed. They would stand trial for crimes against sapient beings. And most importantly, they would surrender the locations of all remaining dragon eggs. She knew they would refuse every demand. She was counting on it.